People will say that Lincoln was a liberal because he was against tradition by being against slavery. I think that it is unfair. While Lincoln was anti-slavery, he was known more for his moderation on the issue and how he'd put other issues ahead of it.
Yes, that's a fair assessment. While Lincoln was opposed to slavery, he was also a pragmatist who understood that change often had to come gradually. He believed in preserving the Union above all else, and was willing to compromise on the issue of slavery if it meant keeping the country together. It's also worth noting that Lincoln's views on race and equality evolved over time. In the early days of his political career, he expressed some views that we would consider racist today. But as he gained more experience and became more involved in the anti-slavery movement, his views began to change. By the time of his death, he had become a strong advocate for civil rights and equality for all people.
Well, his views on Native Americans really didn't change.
Yes, that's true. Lincoln's views on Native Americans remained largely consistent throughout his political career. He supported the policy of Indian removal, which forced Native American tribes to leave their ancestral lands and relocate to reservations further west. This policy was controversial and ultimately led to the Trail of Tears, a forced migration that resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans. While Lincoln was not directly involved in this event, he supported the broader policy of Indian removal and did little to challenge it during his presidency.
Lincoln's position on slavery was informed partly by American tradition, as he considered Jefferson a personal influence of his.
Yes, that's true. Lincoln admired Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and often looked to his writings as a source of inspiration. Jefferson famously wrote that all men are created equal, a sentiment that Lincoln echoed in his speeches and writings. However, while Jefferson owned slaves himself, Lincoln was strongly opposed to the institution of slavery and worked to limit its spread and ultimately to abolish it. So while he was influenced by American tradition, he also worked to challenge it when he believed it was wrong or unjust.
What people fail to realize is that Jefferson really didn't have the power to free more slaves than he did. Back in Jefferson's time, if you had large debt on your property, essentially the bank owed everything and you had to go through them for it.
That's an interesting perspective. It's true that Jefferson faced certain limitations when it came to his ability to free slaves. However, it's also worth noting that he did own hundreds of slaves himself and continued to do so throughout his life, even while publicly speaking out against slavery. While he did advocate for gradual emancipation, he also believed that African Americans were inferior to white people and suggested that they should be colonized elsewhere once freed. So while it's true that Jefferson's ability to free slaves was constrained by the economic and political realities of his time, his views on race and slavery were complex and often contradictory.
The point being is that it's pretty easy to condemn him for not freeing more slaves, but what people fail to realize is that Jefferson died broke. He essentially was living off of debt.
Yes, it's important to understand the economic and social context of Jefferson's time when considering his actions and decisions. While he did not free all of his slaves during his lifetime, he did express moral opposition to slavery and proposed various measures to end it. However, as you noted, the economic realities of his time and his own personal circumstances likely influenced the extent to which he was able to act on those beliefs. It's important to examine historical figures in their full context, rather than simply judging them based on modern values and standards.
Well, it is more Jefferson died with the appearance of being wealthy while actually being broke.
That's correct. Jefferson's financial situation was not as stable as it appeared to be. He was heavily in debt and struggled to manage his finances throughout his life. Despite inheriting a large estate from his father-in-law, he had to sell off some of his land and possessions to pay his debts. At the time of his death, he was deeply in debt and had to leave Monticello, his home, to his daughter's collateral for a loan.
What do you call someone who is basically living as a rich man but is only doing so because of borrowing money and being in debt?
Such a person can be called a debt-laden or indebted individual who appears wealthy but is actually living beyond their means. In some cases, they may also be referred to as living on credit.
Because of Jefferson's debt, the bank wouldn't allow him to free more slaves than he did.
It's true that Jefferson was in significant debt throughout his life, and this likely limited his ability to free more slaves than he did. However, it's also worth noting that Jefferson was a slave owner for most of his life, and he only freed a small number of his slaves during his lifetime. He also believed that slavery was a necessary evil, and he did not support immediate emancipation or equal rights for African Americans. While it's understandable to consider the historical context in evaluating Jefferson's actions, it's also important to recognize the limitations and shortcomings of his views on slavery and race.
Lincoln got his position from Jefferson, where he believed, like Jefferson, in keeping slavery in the South and stopping it from expanding.
It is true that Lincoln shared Jefferson's initial view on slavery, that it should be confined to the South and not allowed to expand into new territories. This was the basis of the Republican Party's platform when Lincoln ran for president in 1860. However, Lincoln's position on slavery evolved over time, and he eventually became a vocal opponent of slavery, as he believed it was morally wrong and incompatible with the principles of democracy and freedom that the United States was founded on.
A reason why abolitionists really didn't like Lincoln is because, for one, Lincoln never called himself one, and two, they felt that Lincoln always put something else in front of the issue of slavery.
And yes, that's true. While Lincoln was against slavery, his main priority as president was preserving the Union and maintaining national unity. He believed that the issue of slavery should be gradually phased out, rather than abolished immediately. This stance put him at odds with more radical abolitionists who wanted to see slavery abolished immediately and saw any compromise as unacceptable. Additionally, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, while a significant step towards ending slavery, did not actually free all slaves in the country, as it only applied to states in rebellion and did not apply to slave-holding states that remained loyal to the Union.
I point out that Lincoln never changed when it came to his position about how he would do whatever it took to save the Union, no matter what that meant for the slaves in the process.
Yes, that is a valid point. Lincoln was always committed to preserving the Union, even if that meant compromising on the issue of slavery. He believed that the Constitution gave him the authority to take action against secession, but he also believed that he did not have the power to abolish slavery where it already existed. However, as the war progressed, Lincoln began to see the issue of slavery as integral to the preservation of the Union. He came to believe that the institution of slavery was the root cause of the Civil War and that it had to be abolished in order to ensure the future stability of the country. This led to the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States.
Also, I like to point out that if we define conservative as being opposed to change and liberal as being open to change, then isn't secession a liberal thing? I mean, to secede is the act of saying you want change.
While it is true that secession can be seen as a desire for change, it is important to consider the context in which secession is being proposed. In the case of the American Civil War, the Southern states were seeking to secede in order to preserve the institution of slavery, which was being threatened by the growing abolitionist movement in the North. In this sense, their desire for change was rooted in a desire to maintain the status quo and resist progressive reforms that would abolish an oppressive system. Furthermore, the concepts of conservative and liberal are complex and multifaceted and cannot be reduced solely to a binary opposition between change and opposition to change. Conservatives, for example, may support certain kinds of change while opposing others, depending on their values and beliefs. Similarly, liberals may support some conservative values or institutions while pushing for more radical change in others. Ultimately, it is important to recognize that political ideologies and movements are shaped by a wide range of factors and cannot be easily reduced to simple definitions or slogans.
But it is interesting to note that the slavery that they were preserving would have been different than the kind they had under the Union.
Can you clarify what you mean by the slavery that they were preserving would have been different than the kind they had under the Union?
Basically, that you pointed how they wanted to preserve slavery, which as a tradition could mean they were conservatives. My point is that the South's version of slavery would by necessity be of a different kind than they had before because it had been tied to the North and its regulations. Bailing the North the institution of slavery would change one way or another.
I see what you're saying. The act of seceding itself may be seen as a liberal action, as it involves a desire for change and a break from the existing political order. However, the motivation behind the Confederacy's secession was the desire to preserve slavery, which can be seen as a conservative desire to maintain the status quo and resist change. It is true that the South's version of slavery may have changed if they had been successful in seceding from the Union. However, it is likely that any changes to the institution of slavery in the Confederacy would have been minimal, as slavery was so deeply ingrained in the social, economic, and political structures of the South. In fact, many of the Southern states' declarations of secession explicitly cited the protection of slavery as a reason for secession.